the smell of fresh hay mixed with the sharp scent of leather as Marcus Mark Taylor adjusted his gloves, his fingers tight around the reins. The stables were alive with the quiet stir of horses moving in their stalls, their soft snorts and rhythmic pawing filling the air. But Mark's focus was on the horse in front of him, Shadow's Pride, a chestnut stallion with a sleek coat that gleamed even in the dim light of the barn. Mark had trained with Shadow's Pride for months now. The horse a reminder of his mother's voice, the one that always told him he had to work twice as hard to be seen, to be acknowledged. He was used to that. The world always expected him to be better than everyone else. He had been raised in this world of racing, and now, at 24, Mark was on the verge of proving he belonged in it. He wasn't just a jockey. He was the jockey, or at least, he would be if the world didn't insist on looking past him. "You ready for this, boy?" Mark murmured, patting the horse's neck. Mark stood in the stable for a few moments, feeling the energy of the place. Race day, the atmosphere electrified with anticipation. This was the kind of morning he had worked for, the kind that would change everything. Today wasn't just any race. This was the Belmont Stakes, one of the most prestigious races in the country, a competition that could make or break a jockey's career. As Mark stepped out of the barn, he could hear the faint roar of the crowd gathering at the track. The racetrack was just down the road from the stable, and even now, as the sun began to rise over the horizon, the tension was palpable. Horses were being prepped, trainers barked orders, and spectators buzzed with excitement. It was all part of the ritual. For most people, it was a day of celebration. For Mark, it was an obstacle, a reminder of everything he had yet to prove. He mounted Shadow's Pride, adjusting his helmet and tightening the straps of his racing silks. His mind wandered for a brief moment to the faces that had doubted him, that had seen him as a token, someone who had only gotten this far because of a diversity quota or the pity of the higher-ups in the industry. No matter how much talent he had, no matter how hard he worked, there were always whispers that he had only made it this far because of the color of his skin. He had to work twice as hard, and sometimes even that wasn't enough. The truth was, a black jockey in a sport dominated by wealthy white families and old money was like a unicorn, rare and almost unheard of. Most of the other jockeys, like those from the Sterling family, came from generations of racing dynasties. They had the money, the connections, the privilege to back them up. Mark, on the other hand, had grit, talent, and the relentless determination to prove that the track was just as much his as it was theirs. As he jogged Shadow's Pride out toward the starting line, Mark noticed a familiar figure standing by the paddock gate. It was William Sterling, a well-known racehorse owner who had made his fortune in the industry and one of the most influential figures in the sport. His white, sharp features and meticulously groomed hair were a stark contrast to Mark's black skin, but what caught Mark's attention wasn't his appearance. It was the look in Sterling's eyes. Sterling had always treated Mark with a quiet, subtle disdain, never quite overtly rude, but always making sure his presence was felt. Mark had always chalked it up to the old man's reputation. Sterling had built his empire on the backs of men like Mark, the ones he considered "Looking good, Taylor," Sterling said as Mark passed, his tone just a touch too patronizing. Mark nodded, keeping his eyes straight ahead, but the words gnawed at him. It was always like this with Sterling, cold, calculating and dismissive. He had known from the start that Sterling had no faith in him. As Mark approached the starting line, he glanced down at his horse, at the muscles rippling beneath the chestnut coat. He had put everything into this moment, every sacrifice, every hour spent training, every injury that had tested his resolve. Shadow's Pride was more than just a horse to him. He was a partner, someone Mark trusted implicitly, someone who understood him without needing words. The bell rang, signaling that the race was about to begin. The other horses and jockeys took their places, their faces a mixture of focus and intensity. Mark took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. But more than that, he felt something else, something deeper. This race was about more than just winning. It was about proving to everyone who thought he didn't belong that he did. "Take it home, boy," Mark whispered to Shadow's Pride. The gates opened, and the race began. horses thundering across the track, hooves striking the earth with an unrelenting rhythm. Mark's heart raced in time with the beat of the horse's strides. The air was thick with the dust of the track, and he leaned forward, his body in sync with his horse. For the first time, Mark felt the world fall away. There was only him and Shadow's pride, and together they had one goal: victory. But even as they surged ahead, Mark could feel Sterling's eyes on him, feel the weight of his doubt, his judgment. It made Mark push harder, faster, knowing that with every step he was proving them all wrong. As they rounded the final curve, the finish line came into view. Mark's grip on the reins tightened, his focus narrowing to the stretch ahead. He could see the other jockeys pulling ahead, but he refused to let them pass. His breath was ragged, his body screaming for rest, but Shadow's pride surged forward, as if sensing the very core of Mark's determination. With one final burst, Mark and Shadow's pride crossed the finish line. The crowd erupted into cheers, but Mark didn't hear them. He was too focused on the horse beneath him, the smooth motion of their joint effort, their shared victory. As the dust settled, Mark raised his head high, his chest swelling with pride. They had done it. They had proven something. Sterling's face was a mixture of disbelief and disdain, but Mark didn't care. He had won, and that was all that mattered. 2. The celebration was brief, the joy of victory quickly swallowed by the cold, calculating reality of the racing world. Mark sat in the winner's circle, surrounded by reporters, photographers, and sponsors, all eager to claim a piece of the spotlight that had briefly shone on him. Shadow's pride was draped in a blanket of roses, his coat glistening with sweat as he stood tall. Mark smiled for the cameras, but the smiles felt like they were painted on. The congratulatory handshakes felt forced, the cheers hollow. He had won the race, but in the back of his mind, the real battle had only just begun. Winning a race like this was a career-defining moment, sure. But to people like William Sterling, it was just another hurdle to overcome. And Sterling wasn't going to let this victory slide easily. After the last interview ended, Mark made his way back to the paddock, his steps slow, deliberate. He could feel eyes on him, some admiring, others jealous. He was used to it by now. His success, his talent, had always made some people uncomfortable. It wasn't just because he was a black man in a predominantly... William Sterling approached him, his polished boots clicking against the pavement, the starch of his white button-up shirt sharp against the bright summer sky. The older man's face was tight, his jaw clenched in that way that meant he was trying and failing to maintain composure. "You did well today," Sterling said, his tone cool and clipped, as if it physically pained him to say the words. "Thank you," Mark replied, keeping his response neutral, knowing that any sign of arrogance would only fuel Sterling's hatred. Sterling took a step closer, his gaze scanning the area, making sure no one was within earshot. "But don't get too comfortable, Taylor. This race doesn't mean anything in the grand scheme of things. You're still just a token, a novelty. You think one win at the Belmont changes how people see you?" Mark clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He could feel the old man's disdain like a weight pressing down on him, but he didn't back down. He knew better than to let Sterling see his anger. "You know as well as I do, Mr. Sterling, that I didn't win because of my race. I won because I'm good, and I'll keep proving that every chance I get." Sterling's lips curled into a humorless smile. "You think so? You might have won today, but I don't forget who I'm dealing with. People like you. You don't get to change the rules of the game, no matter how many races you win." Mark took a deep breath, fighting the urge to snap back. He had been here before, facing down the old prejudices, the whispers in the back rooms, the subtle racism that often went unnoticed by those in power. But he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every black jockey, for every person who had ever been told they couldn't make it because of the color of their skin. "I'm not your problem, Mr. Sterling," Mark said, his voice calm but firm. "You're just mad because I beat you, and I'll keep doing it until you can't ignore me anymore." Sterling's eyes narrowed, his smile faltering for just a moment before he recovered, his usual arrogance returning. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice. With a final cold glance, Sterling turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Mark stood there, his heart pounding, a familiar bitterness settling in his chest. He had won the race, but he had lost something too. The fleeting hope that maybe, just maybe, the world would see him as more than just a black jockey. As Mark walked back to his trailer, he could feel the eyes of the other jockeys on him. Some were congratulating him, others avoided his gaze. But one thing was clear: they knew. They knew the fight wasn't over, and they knew that the victory wasn't as sweet when you had to keep proving yourself at every turn. He entered the small, dimly lit trailer that served as his temporary home, the walls lined with racing memorabilia and old trophies, reminders of how far he'd come. He slumped into the chair, his hands running through his hair. The adrenaline of the race still buzzed in his veins, but the weight of Sterling's words clung to him like a shadow. It wasn't just about winning races. It was about being recognized, truly recognized, for his talent. The victory was just the beginning. There were still people, like Sterling, who saw him as a threat, but not one that belonged. He couldn't let that stop him. He couldn't let them keep him in this small box they had built around him. Mark Taylor wasn't going to be their token. He wasn't going to be their black stallion. He was going to be the best, period. The question was, how far would he have to go to make them see that? 3. The days after the Belmont Stakes felt like a whirlwind. The press calls, the interviews, the sponsorship offers, it all came flooding in. Mark was the talk of the racing world, the first African-American jockey to win the prestigious race in decades. Everyone wanted a piece of him. Everyone wanted to know how he did it. But what they didn't ask was why he did it. He had seen the way people treated him. His victory wasn't a triumph. It was a spectacle, a narrative they could sell. The moment the cameras were off, the press had moved on to the next big thing. But the reality of his struggle was something few were willing to acknowledge. And as if on cue, William Sterling's shadow loomed over him once again. The phone rang one morning, the shrill sound cutting through the quiet of Mark's trailer. He stared at it for a moment, the caller ID reading, "Sterling Racing." His fingers hovered over the receiver before he picked it up. "Mark Taylor," he said, his voice steady, his eyes locked on the dust motes floating in the air. "Mr. Taylor," came the voice on the other end. Sterling's assistant, Tanya. "Mr. Sterling would like to meet with you. It's about an opportunity. A collaboration, if you will." Mark's gut tightened. He had expected something like this after the race. Sterling never did anything without his own agenda. He didn't call it collaboration, unless it was going to benefit him in some way. "I'm listening," Mark said, trying to keep the skepticism out of his voice. "Mr. Sterling wants to discuss future rides. He's willing to put you on some of the best horses, but it's conditional. He'll want your full commitment, Mark. You know what that means." Mark knew exactly what that meant. Sterling had never been known for giving anything without a price. His opportunities always came with strings attached, usually ones that bound you tighter than any contract could. But a part of Mark wanted to hear him out. This was his chance to prove to everyone, especially Sterling, that he wasn't just a flash in the pan. "I'll come by this afternoon," Mark said, his voice taut with tension. Later that afternoon, Mark found himself in the opulent offices of Sterling Racing. The walls were lined with trophies, silver cups, and framed photographs of the Sterling family with various racehorses. The air smelled faintly of leather and rich wood, and the windows offered a stunning view of the stables, where horses were being groomed for upcoming races. Mark stepped into Sterling's office, his boots clicking against the marble floor. William Sterling was sitting behind a massive oak desk, his hands steepled in front of him as he surveyed Mark with a cold, calculating gaze. "Mark," Sterling said, his tone almost too polite. Sit. We have much to discuss." Mark sat across from him, keeping his posture straight. Sterling wasted no time, jumping straight to business. "Let's get right to it. I'm offering you a chance to ride in the big leagues, Mark. I've got some top-tier horses, champions, potential champions, and I'm willing to give you the reins." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes glinting. "But you're going to have to prove your loyalty first." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Loyalty? What does that mean?" Sterling's lips curled into a thin smile. "It means putting the team first, Mark. It means making sure that Sterling Racing is always in the spotlight. If I'm going to let you race my horses, I need you to be more than just a jockey. I need you to be my jockey. You'll race exclusively for my stable, no exceptions. You'll stay away from other stables, other offers. And you'll make sure that everything you do, every race you run, reflects well on me." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Mark had heard of deals like this before, deals where the stakes were high, but the cost was even higher. Sterling was offering him the world, but only if he gave up his independence, his very identity as a jockey. Mark had always prided himself on his choices, on the freedom to follow his gut and ride for the horses that spoke to him, not just the ones that came with the most money. "Why me?" Mark asked, his voice measured, though the tension in his chest was growing. "What makes me worth all this?" Sterling's gaze softened, almost patronizing. Mark felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The words, "my champion," rang in his ears like a bell, and he knew then that this wasn't just about racing, it was about control. Sterling didn't see him as an equal, as a fellow competitor. To him, Mark was a prize, a tool to be used to further his own empire. "So what's the catch?" Mark asked bluntly. Sterling's eyes gleamed. "There's no catch, just a simple agreement. Your future with my stable, your future as a jockey, all depends on you staying loyal. No more outside distractions, but in the end, wasn't that what he had been fighting for all along? To be seen? To be recognized for his talent, his potential?" Mark took a deep breath, his voice steady. "I'll need some time to think about it." Sterling nodded, his expression unreadable. "Of course, take all the time you need. But remember, opportunities like this don't come around often." As Mark stood to leave, he felt the weight of Sterling's gaze follow him out the door. He wasn't sure what he was going to do. He hadn't even started racing for himself yet. Not really. He had always been fighting for something more. But what was that? The wind blew gently across the racetrack, stirring the dust on the ground. Mark stood by the fence, watching the horses being saddled for the day's race. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the field, but Mark's mind was elsewhere, on the conversation he had had with William Sterling just days ago. Sterling's offer had been tempting. The chance to race with some of the finest horses in the world, to be at the top of his game, to have everything Mark had ever dreamed. "Mr. Taylor, the race is about to start." The assistant's voice snapped him out of his reverie. Mark nodded and straightened up, his muscles tense with anticipation. This wasn't just another race. This was his race, his final decision, his stand. Today, he would make his choice. Would he accept Sterling's offer and be bound by his rules? Or would he take his chances and race on his own terms for himself? He glanced. Sterling was already there, his eyes scanning the track, his presence as commanding as ever. He turned toward Mark as he approached, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You've made your decision, I assume?" Sterling asked, his voice smooth, like oil on water. Mark took a deep breath. "I've made my decision," he said, his voice steady but firm. "And?" Sterling's eyebrows raised, almost mockingly. "I'm not taking your offer," Mark said, locking eyes with him. "I'll race for my own name, for my own future, not for you, and not for anyone else." Sterling's face tightened, the smile fading. His posture stiffened, and for a moment the room seemed to grow colder. "You're making a mistake, Mark. A huge one. You'll regret this." Mark shook his head. The silence between them stretched for a few beats, thick with tension. But then, Sterling's lips curled into something resembling a grin, cold, but genuine in its own twisted way. "You think you're better off on your own?" Sterling asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "You're not a part of this world, Mark. You never will be. You're just a distraction." Mark stood tall. "I'm not a distraction. I'm a force." Sterling snorted, turning his back on him. He walked past Sterling, heading towards the starting line where Shadow's Pride was waiting. The horse's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment it felt as if time stood still. This wasn't about making a statement anymore. It wasn't about fighting for recognition or proving someone wrong. It was about doing what he loved, what they both loved. It was about the race, the partnership between horse and rider, and the triumph of pushing past every obstacle in their way. The starter raised his flag, signaling the horses to line up. Mark mounted Shadow's Pride, adjusting his helmet, his hands steady as he gripped the reins. The other jockeys were positioned at their starting gates, their faces a mixture of focus and determination. The announcer's voice blared over the loudspeaker. The gates opened with a deafening crash, and the horses surged forward, the crowd roaring as the race began. Mark and Shadow's Pride moved seamlessly as one, each stride a calculated move, each turn a testament to their training, their trust in each other. The competition was fierce, but Mark's mind was clear, his focus locked on the track ahead. He wasn't racing to win for anyone else, he was racing for himself. As they rounded the final bend, Mark's breath quickened, the finish line coming into view. The other jockeys were closing in, but Mark and Shadow's Pride had one last burst of speed in them. Mark leaned forward, his body in perfect sync with the horse beneath him. The crowd screamed, their cheers rising. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as the cheers washed over him, but this time they felt different. This was his victory, his and Shadow's Pride's, no one else's, not Sterling's, not the racing world's, his. As they pulled up to cool down, Mark let out a long breath, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. The weight that had been pressing down on him for weeks finally lifted. For the first time, he truly felt free. Sterling's voice echoed in his mind one last time. People like you don't last. Mark's lips curled into a small smile. Maybe, but I'm still here. And for the first time in his life, Mark knew that this was where he belonged. The racing world didn't define him. His talent, his heart, and his will to succeed did. And no matter what anyone said, nothing could take that away.